They dragged him into court like a criminal until the truth came out. What happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. The cold courtroom buzzed with whispers as John Reynolds, a homeless veteran, stood in front of the judge. Dressed in tattered clothes, his hands rough from years on the streets, he kept his head high, even as people in the gallery sneered at him. The prosecutor smirked, shuffling his papers. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught trespassing on private property. Again, this is not his first offense." John clenched his jaw, but remained silent. He knew how people like him were treated. The judge peered over his glasses. "Mr. Reynolds, do you have any defense for your actions?" John took a deep breath. "I wasn't trespassing, Your Honor. I was sleeping behind the old library." A snicker rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor chuckled. "That's still trespassing." John exhaled slowly. He had been in combat zones, seen friends die in war, and now he was being treated like a criminal for having nowhere to go. The judge sighed. "Mr. Reynolds, do you have legal representation?" Before John could answer, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. A sharply dressed man in an expensive suit strode in. Every head turned. John's eyes widened in shock, because he knew exactly who this man was, and what he said next would change everything. The man in the expensive suit walked straight to the defense table, his presence commanding the entire room. He set down his briefcase and turned to the judge. "Apologies for being late, Your Honor. I'm here to represent Mr. Reynolds." John's breath hitched. He hadn't had a lawyer. He couldn't afford one. But now, one of the most powerful attorneys in the country was standing beside him. The judge frowned. "And you are?" The man adjusted his cufflinks. "Daniel Harrington, managing partner of Harrington and Tate." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Harrington and Tate was one of the most elite law firms in the country. The prosecutor's smug expression vanished. John was still in shock. He turned to Harrington, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" Harrington gave him a small smile. "Because I owe you." John's mind reeled. Owed him. How? Harrington turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to present some critical information about my client." He opened his briefcase, pulled out a file, and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the papers. The more he read, the deeper his frown grew. Finally, he looked up. "Is this true, Mr. Reynolds?" John hesitated. He didn't even know what was in that file, but Harrington nodded toward him. "Go ahead, tell them." John exhaled. "Yes, Your Honor. It's true." The judge leaned forward. "Then I think the courtroom needs to hear it." John swallowed hard, then turned to face the crowd. "I'm not just a homeless man. I'm a decorated Marine. And the property I was trespassing on?" He glanced at the prosecutor. "I fought for that land, I bled for it, and now I have nothing." The room fell into stunned silence, and the prosecutor looked like he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because this case was no longer about trespassing, it was about justice, and John Reynolds was about to get the respect he had long been denied. The courtroom remained dead silent. John's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time since the hearing began, the judge's expression softened. The prosecutor, who had been so smug moments ago, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the defendant's background is notable, it doesn't change the fact that he was unlawfully on private property." Harrington smirked. "Actually, it changes everything." He turned to the judge and gestured toward the file. "Contained in those documents are Mr. Reynolds' military records, his commendations, his years of service, the very land he was found on. It's an abandoned property that once belonged to a veterans organization, one that was supposed to provide housing for homeless veterans." The judge's eyes narrowed. Supposed to. Harrington nodded. Yes, Your Honor. That property was originally set aside for veterans in need, but somewhere along the way funding disappeared. The organization was quietly dissolved, and now the land is sitting empty while men like Mr. Reynolds are sleeping in the cold. A murmur spread through the courtroom. John swallowed hard. He had no idea about any of this. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Is this true? The prosecutor flipped through the documents, his face turning a sickly shade of white. He hesitated before mumbling, It appears so, Your Honor. The judge's expression hardened. So let me get this straight. This man, a Marine who fought for this country, is being dragged into my courtroom for simply seeking shelter on land that was supposed to be his in the first place? The prosecutor stammered. I wasn't aware of that when we filed the charges. The judge exhaled sharply. Then perhaps you should do your homework before prosecuting an American hero. The courtroom erupted in whispers. John felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Harrington smoothed his tie, then spoke with quiet authority. Your Honor, I move to have this case dismissed immediately. The judge didn't even hesitate. Case dismissed. Mr. Reynolds, you are free to go. Relief flooded John's body, but before he could even process it, Harrington wasn't done. He turned to John with a smile. Oh, and one more thing. John raised an eyebrow. What now? Harrington clapped a hand on his shoulder. I pulled some strings. You're not just walking out of here a free man. John frowned. What do you mean? Harrington smirked. You have a job waiting for you, and a place to stay. John's breath hitched. You're serious? Harrington nodded. I never forget the people who saved my life. John's mind reeled. He had no idea what Harrington was talking about until he looked closer. And then it hit him. Afghanistan. Years ago, John had pulled a wounded soldier from the wreckage of an ambushed convoy. A young officer, barely breathing, clinging to life. That officer had been Daniel Harrington. John's hands trembled. Harrington smiled. You saved me once. Now, I'm just returning the favor. John swallowed the lump in his throat. For the first time in years, he wasn't just another forgotten veteran. He was seen, respected, given another chance. And as he walked out of that courtroom, a free man, a new future ahead of him, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just justice. This was redemption. 1 year later, the grand opening of the Reynolds Housing Initiative was a moment John never thought he'd live to see. He stood in front of a brand new housing complex, built specifically for homeless veterans, a place where men like him could rebuild their lives, find jobs, and get the support they deserved. And standing beside him, Daniel Harrington. John adjusted his tie, a real tie, not something he picked up from a shelter. He still wasn't used to wearing a suit, but today, he wore it with pride. The crowd quieted as he stepped up to the microphone. He took a deep breath, looking at the faces of veterans, community leaders, and reporters gathered before him. 1 year ago, I was standing in a courtroom, being treated like a criminal for trying to survive. A murmur spread through the crowd. I had lost everything, my home, my purpose, my dignity. And for a long time, I thought no one cared. But someone did. He turned to Daniel, nodding. I saved his life once, and when I had nowhere else to turn, he saved mine. Daniel smirked slightly, folding his arms as the crowd erupted into applause. John continued, his voice strong. This isn't just about me. It's about the thousands of veterans who are forgotten every single day. The ones who fought for this country and came home to nothing. That ends today. He gestured to the building behind him. This is their second chance, their fresh start. And I swear to you, as long as I'm standing, no veteran will ever be left behind again. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. John exhaled, his chest swelling with pride. 1 year ago he had walked into a courtroom with nothing. Today, he was giving others the chance he had once prayed for. As Daniel clapped him on the back, John realized this wasn't just a victory, this was his legacy. 5 years later, John Reynolds stood on the steps of Capitol Hill, staring out at the massive crowd that had gathered. He had once been a forgotten veteran, sleeping on the streets. Now, he was standing before the nation, fighting for those who had been left behind. Behind him, a banner read, "Veterans First Act, a new era for our heroes." He adjusted his suit jacket, still getting used to the idea that people looked to him for leadership now. 5 years ago, he was a man on trial. Today, he was the face of a nationwide movement. Daniel Harrington stood beside him, now a major philanthropist dedicated to veteran causes. Their unlikely friendship had turned into something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. John stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady and strong. 5 years ago, I was arrested for trespassing. But the truth? I wasn't trespassing. I was surviving. The crowd listened in silence. That day in court, I thought my life was over. But instead, it was just beginning. Because someone believed in me. And now it's my turn to fight for the ones still out there. Struggling, forgotten, abandoned. He pointed toward the massive Capitol building behind him. This bill will ensure no veteran is left without a home, without medical care, or without purpose. We served this country, and now it's time for this country to serve us. The audience erupted into applause. John turned to Daniel, a small smirk on his face. Not bad for a guy they once wanted to throw in jail, huh? Daniel chuckled. Not bad at all. As John stepped back, letting the applause wash over him, he realized something. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was a movement. And as long as he was standing, he would make sure no veteran was ever forgotten again.